There is a relationship dynamic so common that it has become almost invisible, embedded so thoroughly in the landscape of human connection that most people who are living inside it do not recognize it as a dynamic at all. They experience it as love. They experience it as devotion, as loyalty, as the particular quality of caring that means staying when leaving would be easier. That means trying when trying costs something. That means adjusting and accommodating and shrinking just enough to fit inside the space that another person can tolerate. The codependent in relationship with an avoidant does not experience themselves as someone participating in a system. They experience themselves as someone who loves deeply and is not quite loved back in the way they need. And they have developed a working hypothesis, refined over months or years, that if they can just find the right combination of behaviors, the right level of need expression, the right balance between being present and not being too much, the other person will finally give them what they have been waiting for. This hypothesis is not irrational. It is a product of a relational environment that intermittently rewards the waiting. But the hypothesis is wrong, and the wrongness of it is not a simple misunderstanding. It is a structural feature of the dynamic itself, a dynamic in which two wounded attachment systems have found each other with a precision that looks like fate and functions like a trap. What the codependent has not yet understood, and what this analysis is designed to make visible, is that their codependency is not incidental to the avoidance functioning. It is essential to it. The system does not produce their suffering as a side effect. Their suffering is the system's operating condition. The codependence reaching is the mechanism by which the avoidance distance is maintained. Their longing is the fuel that keeps the dynamic running. Their willingness to stay, to try again, to interpret the avoidance warmth as evidence that something different is possible, is the single most important ingredient in a system that would dissolve without it. Understanding this is not about assigning blame. It is about accuracy, and accuracy is the only thing that makes genuine change possible for either person. Number 1. What codependency actually is beneath the word itself? The word codependency has been used so broadly and applied so inconsistently that it has lost much of its precision. And reclaiming that precision is necessary before the dynamic between codependent and avoidant individuals can be examined with any accuracy. Codependency is not simply caring too much. It is not the ordinary experience of loving someone who does not love back with equivalent intensity. It is a specific psychological organization in which a person's sense of self, their emotional regulation, and their experience of safety in the world are anchored not in their own interior, but in the emotional state and relational availability of another person. The codependent individual does not have a stable internal reference point for how they are doing. They have an external one. How they feel about themselves at any given moment is significantly determined by how the person they are attached to seems to feel about them. And the maintenance of that person's positive regard becomes the primary organizational task of their daily psychological life. This organization has an origin in early experience, as most significant psychological patterns do. The child who learned that their own well-being was contingent on managing the emotional state of a caregiver, who discovered that the way to secure love and safety was to monitor the caregiver's needs and subordinate their own to meeting them, who developed an extraordinary sensitivity to the emotional temperature of others at the cost of developing sensitivity to their own interior, became someone whose nervous system is calibrated to scan the relational environment before attending to the self. This is not a character flaw, it is an adaptation to a specific relational environment. As sophisticated in its own way as the avoidance independence, and as thoroughly embedded in the person's sense of identity by the time they reach adulthood. The codependent adult does not typically know that their selfhood is organized around another person. They know they care deeply, They know they sometimes feel lost in relationships. They know there is something about the specific configuration of loving someone who needs space that activates in them a level of longing and anxiety that does not feel proportional to the circumstances. What they do not know, because the pattern is too close to be seen clearly from inside it, is that the organizing principle of their relational life is the management of someone else's emotional state, and that this management has become the primary way they experience themselves as valuable, needed, and real. Number 2, the avoidant structural need and why it cannot be filled from within. The avoidant individual carries a wound that is, at its core, a wound about relational availability. The early experience that created the avoidant attachment style was one in which the caregiver was not consistently emotionally available, in which need expression was met with withdrawal or dismissal, in which the child learned to suppress their own attachment system because activating it produced more pain than suppressing it did. What resulted was a person who functions with a suppressed attachment system, who maintains a self-concept built around independence and self-sufficiency, and who experiences any significant activation of their attachment feelings as threatening, as the precursor to the kind of disappointment the wound has always predicted. The structural need that this creates in the avoidant is complex and largely unconscious. At one level, they need relational distance in order to maintain the suppression that keeps their wound from being fully activated. They need the other person to not require too much, to not push toward the level of intimacy that would bring the wound into direct contact with the relationship. At another level, and this is the level that is rarely examined, they need the other person to remain available, to maintain the pursuit, to sustain the connection at a safe distance. Because the complete absence of connection would require the avoidant to confront the attachment need they have been suppressing. And the confrontation with that need, without a relational object to direct it toward, is more threatening than the managed distance that the current dynamic produces. The avoidant cannot fill this structural need from within themselves. They cannot self-generate the right amount of relational proximity, the precise calibration of closeness and distance that keeps the wound below the threshold of full activation while preventing the loneliness that complete isolation would produce. They need another person to provide the right amount of closeness at a manageable level of pressure, and they need that person to do this consistently, reliably, without requiring reciprocity at the level of genuine emotional intimacy. What they need, in other words, is someone who will pursue without demanding to be fully met. Someone who will stay without requiring the avoidant to show up fully. Someone whose own psychological organization makes them willing to receive very little in exchange for maintaining the connection. The codependent is that person, and the precision with which their respective patterns fit together is the reason this pairing is so remarkably common and so remarkably difficult to exit. The fit is not accidental, and it is not random. Two people whose wounds are this precisely complementary did not find each other by chance. They found each other because the codependent's nervous system, scanning the relational environment for a person who needs them in the specific way their psychology is organized to meet need, recognized the avoidance wound as a compatible shape. And the avoidance system, looking for a person who will provide closeness without requiring it, recognized the codependent's accommodating pattern as safe. The recognition happened quickly, probably in the earliest stages of contact, and it happened below the level of conscious choice. Both people felt drawn toward the other with a certainty that felt like rightness. What it actually was, in more precise terms, was the recognition of complementary wounds finding each other in the dark. Number 3, how the codependent's anxiety regulates the avoidance distance. One of the most important and least visible mechanisms in the codependent-avoidant dynamic is the way the codependent's anxiety functions as a distance regulation tool for the avoidant. This is not a mechanism the avoidant is consciously deploying. It is an emergent property of the system, a functional outcome that neither person designed, but that both people's patterns work together to produce. Understanding it requires looking at what happens in the system at the level of behavior and nervous system response, rather than at the level of intention. The avoidant's primary relational challenge is managing the activation of their attachment system. When they get too close to genuine intimacy, the alarm fires, and they withdraw. When they withdraw too far, the attachment system registers the absence of connection and produces discomfort. The optimal position for the avoidant is one where the connection is maintained at the level just below the activation threshold, where the attachment need is managed but not confronted, where the relational distance is comfortable rather than isolating. Achieving this balance requires the other person to play a specific role. They must be close enough to provide the regulatory benefit of connection, while being prevented from getting close enough to trigger the alarm. The codependent's anxiety accomplishes exactly this. When the avoidant withdraws, the codependent's anxiety intensifies, and the behavioral expression of that anxiety, the increased contact, the emotional bids for reassurance, the escalating attempts to restore the connection, signals to the avoidant system that the connection is still there, that the other person has not left, that the relational object is still present and available. This signal reduces the loneliness that the avoidance withdrawal would otherwise produce. At the same time, the anxiety's expression, the neediness of it, the pressure it creates, gives the avoidant a reason to maintain the distance. The codependent's need becomes the justification for the avoidance withdrawal, which is registered by the avoidant not as a defense mechanism, but as a reasonable response to someone who wants more than is comfortable to provide. The system is self-regulating in a way that serves the avoidant's regulatory needs precisely. When the avoidant gets too distant, the codependent's anxiety increases their pursuit, which provides the connection signal that reduces the avoidant's loneliness. When the codependent gets too close, the avoidant withdraws, which creates the distance the avoidance system requires. The codependent's emotional dysregulation is not a problem the system is trying to solve. It is a feature the system is using to maintain its equilibrium, and the equilibrium it is maintaining is the avoidance. This channel exists to name what most psychology content leaves unspoken, and subscribing means you receive that honesty on every topic that matters. Number 4. The intermittent reinforcement that keeps the codependent locked in. The neurobiological mechanism that most reliably keeps the codependent inside the dynamic is intermittent reinforcement. And understanding it requires acknowledging that this mechanism does not feel like a trap from the inside. It feels like hope. It feels like the specific quality of hope that knows from experience that the thing being waited for is real, because it has been received before, and its previous arrival is the evidence that keeps the waiting alive. This is not a weakness of character or a failure of intelligence. It is the neurological consequence of a specific reinforcement pattern operating on a nervous system that is already organized around the management of relational availability. Intermittent reinforcement is the neurological condition produced when a reward is delivered unpredictably rather than consistently. In laboratory conditions, intermittent reinforcement produces stronger and more persistent behavioral responses than consistent reinforcement does, because the unpredictability of the reward prevents the nervous system from habituating to it, keeps the anticipatory systems activated, and generates a seeking behavior that is not extinguished even by long periods of non-reward. This is the mechanism of gambling. It is also the mechanism that operates in the codependent's relationship with the avoidant's intermittent warmth. The avoidant does not withhold warmth strategically. Their periods of closeness are genuine. When the deactivation lifts, when the alarm quiets, when the defensive system is not running at full suppression, the warmth the avoidant feels and expresses is real. The codependent who has been living through a withdrawal episode receives this genuine warmth, and their nervous system responds as it would to any reward that has been waited for under conditions of deprivation, with an intensity that the warmth itself does not require, but the waiting has made inevitable. The relief is profound. The reconnection feels like confirmation that everything is right, that the relationship is real, that the waiting was justified. This peak intensity of the positive experience, produced by the specific combination of the warmth and the preceding deprivation, is what the codependent's nervous system begins to associate with the relationship. It is not the average experience of the relationship that is being reinforced. It is the peak experience, and the peak is only accessible through the cycle of deprivation and return. The codependent begins, without knowing it, to need the cycle in order to access the level of feeling that makes the relationship feel real and meaningful. The withdrawal and the return become structurally necessary to the codependent's experience of the relationship's value, which means that the withdrawal, the very thing that is causing them suffering, is also the thing that is generating the conditions under which the reconnection produces its most powerful effect. The suffering and the attachment have become intertwined in a way that makes the suffering very difficult to leave, because leaving would mean leaving both. What makes this particularly insidious in the codependent avoidant pairing is that the codependent psychology is already organized around tolerating the absence of what they need in service of maintaining the relationship. The ordinary person might leave after the third or fourth cycle of withdrawal and return when the pattern becomes clear enough to be named. The codependent has a higher tolerance for exactly this kind of deprivation because their entire relational history has trained them to interpret withholding as something to be managed and endured rather than as information about whether the relationship is worth staying in. The intermittent reinforcement works on a nervous system that is already primed to sustain hope, under conditions that would extinguish it in someone with a different psychological organization. Number 5. The codependent's self-erasure as a survival strategy for the relationship. As the codependent-avoidant dynamic develops over time, the codependent undergoes a process of progressive self-erasure that is so gradual and so thoroughly rationalized at each stage that it is rarely recognized as what it is until it has gone very far. The process begins with small adjustments. The codependent learns through experience what kinds of emotional expression trigger the avoidance withdrawal. They learn that direct expressions of need create pressure that the avoidant retreats from. They learn that asking for reassurance produces the opposite of what they are looking for. They learn that their own emotional experience, when expressed with any intensity, is received by the avoidant as a demand rather than as a disclosure. And so they begin to manage it. They begin to contain what they feel, to time their expressions carefully, to monitor the avoidant state before deciding whether it is safe to have needs of their own. Each of these adjustments has a rational quality from inside the dynamic. It is not irrational to learn what another person's limits are and to work within them. It is not irrational to moderate emotional expression when past experience has shown that unmoderated expression produces distance. What is happening, however, is not simply the ordinary relational work of understanding a partner's communication style. It is the gradual subordination of the codependent's own emotional life to the management of the avoidant's comfort, and over time it produces a person who is increasingly unfamiliar to themselves. They have edited themselves down to the version that the relationship can accommodate. And the editing has been so thorough that they have difficulty accessing the unedited version, even when they are not in the avoidant's presence. The self-erasure also extends to the codependent's needs, interests, and relational requirements. In the early stages of the relationship, they had a sense of what they needed from a partnership. Over time, as those needs consistently went unmet, and the relationship's survival required not naming what was missing, those needs were reclassified, first as excessive, then as unrealistic, then as evidence of their own dysfunction, rather than as legitimate human relational requirements. The codependent has absorbed the avoidant's implicit framing of their needs as too much, and has begun to agree with it. This internalized agreement is among the most damaging outcomes of the dynamic, because it leaves the codependent not only without what they need in the relationship, but without the self-concept that would allow them to seek it elsewhere. Number 6. What the avoidant gets that they cannot acknowledge wanting. The avoidant's narrative about themselves is built around not needing. The independence that forms around their wound is experienced as genuine, not as performance. And the idea that they are deriving something essential from the codependent's behavior is fundamentally incompatible with this self-concept. And yet they are. The avoidant in a relationship with a codependent is receiving something that their psychological architecture requires, but their self-concept cannot accommodate, requesting consistent, non-threatening relational proximity. The codependent provides the experience of connection without the level of emotional demand that genuine intimacy would require. They are present, they are available. They are attuned to the avoidant's needs in ways that precede the avoidant having to name them, and they have learned, through the relational training the dynamic provides, to suppress the expressions that would activate the avoidant's alarm. The avoidant also receives, through the dynamic, the regulatory benefit of someone else's emotional labor. The codependent monitors the relationship's emotional temperature. The codependent repairs ruptures. The codependent maintains the connection through the avoidant's withdrawal episodes by continuing to be available when the avoidant is ready to return. All of the relational work that genuine intimacy requires the avoidant system will not allow them to do is done by the codependent, which means the avoidant gets the benefits of sustained connection without having to pay the emotional costs that connection ordinarily requires. There is also something more specific and more significant that the avoidant receives in this dynamic. They receive the confirmation that someone is choosing them, that they are worthy of sustained attention and devotion, without having to risk the vulnerability of directly needing or requesting that confirmation. The codependent's persistence in the face of the avoidant's withdrawal is at a level the avoidant does not consciously access, evidence that they matter. It is the proof of worth delivered in a form the avoidant can receive without acknowledging that they needed it, because the proof arrives uninvited, which means the avoidant does not have to admit to wanting it. The wanting, which is as real as it is in anyone, stays unconscious and the confirmation arrives anyway, mediated by the codependent's relentless availability. This is the most elegant feature of the dynamic for the avoidant. They receive what they need without having to display the vulnerability of need. Number 7. The roles each person plays in maintaining the system. Every self-sustaining relational system requires both participants to play specific roles, and the codependent-avoidant dynamic is no different. The roles are not assigned consciously and are not maintained through deliberate coordination. They emerge from the interaction of two psychological organizations that happen to fit together in a way that allows each person's wound to remain just far enough below the surface to be managed. Understanding the specific role each person plays is essential to understanding why the system is so resistant to change, even when both people are aware of it and both people in some part of themselves genuinely want something different. The codependent's role is to be the pursuer, the nurturer, the emotional laborer, the one who maintains the connection through periods when the avoidant is not doing their part to maintain it. This role activates the codependent's deepest sense of purpose. because their psychological organization is built around the management of another person's emotional state. And this relationship provides them with a permanent occupation for that organization. The codependent in this role does not feel like someone who is suffering. Or rather, the suffering is present, but it is mixed with something that feels like meaning. The relationship, even in its painful dimensions, gives them somewhere to direct the enormous emotional energy that their codependency generates. They are needed. They have a project. Their capacity for devotion has an object. The suffering is the cost of the meaning, and the meaning is real enough that the cost seems, most of the time, worth paying. The avoidance role is to be the one who is pursued, the one who maintains the distance that generates the pursuit, the one who provides the intermittent warmth that keeps the codependent's hope alive. This role aligns with the avoidant self-concept in a way that makes it difficult to recognize as a role at all. They are not doing something the dynamic requires. They are being who they are, someone who needs space, someone who values independence, someone who is not comfortable with the level of emotional intensity the other person generates. From inside the role, the avoidant is simply a person with legitimate needs that happen not to be compatible with their partner's legitimate needs. What they cannot see from inside the role is the way their behavior is not simply a response to their own needs, but a systemic contribution to the maintenance of a dynamic that is organized around their comfort at the cost of their partners. Number 8. Why leaving feels impossible for the codependent. The codependent who has been in this dynamic for any significant length of time typically experiences the impossibility of leaving not as an external constraint, but as an internal one. And the internal constraint is not simply emotional attachment, though the attachment is real and significant. The impossibility of leaving is structural, built from several overlapping layers of psychological reality that each contribute to the experience of being unable to exit. The first layer is the internalized belief that the relationship's difficulties are primarily their own fault. The dynamic has trained the codependent to interpret the avoidance withdrawal as a response to something they did, said, or expressed. The implicit message of the avoidance retreat, which the codependent has absorbed over time, is that they are too much, too needy, too emotional, too intense, too demanding. The codependent who believes this cannot leave in good conscience, because leaving would mean abandoning someone they have harmed, rather than acknowledging that they are in a relationship that is harmful to them. The self-blame keeps them in place by converting the legitimate experience of being underserved into evidence of their own inadequacy. The second layer is the loss of self that has occurred during the relationship. The codependent who has systematically edited themselves down to the version the relationship can accommodate has difficulty locating a self that exists independently of the relationship. The question of who they are outside of this dynamic, what they want when what they want is not organized around the management of this particular person, is not a question they can answer easily, because the answering requires access to an interior they have not fully inhabited in a very long time. Leaving would require them to reoccupy themselves, and the self they would return to is unfamiliar in ways that are frightening rather than liberating. The third layer is the specific cruelty of leaving at the wrong moment. The dynamic's intermittent reinforcement means that the avoidance warmth and the codependent relief tend to arrive at precisely the moments when the codependent has gathered the most resolve to leave. The reconnection with its genuine warmth and its neurobiological intensity dissolves the resolve and replaces it with the feeling that the relationship is real and worth staying for. The codependent goes through this cycle many times, and each time the cycle completes, the self-judgment about not having left adds another layer to the psychological difficulty of actually doing so. There is also a fourth layer that is rarely named with adequate directness. The codependent's identity has become organized around this relationship. in a way that makes leaving equivalent to a kind of self-dissolution. They are, in their own self-conception, the person who loves this particular avoidant, who stays, who tries, who understands what others would not be patient enough to understand. This identity, however painful its content, provides a coherent answer to the question of who they are. Leaving the relationship means relinquishing the identity along with it, and the question of who they are without it is one they do not yet have an answer to. The staying is, among other things, a postponement of that question, and as long as the question can be postponed, the leaving remains impossibly abstract, even to people who can clearly see from every external angle that they should go. Number 9. The myth of the codependent as victim and the avoidant as perpetrator. The framing of the codependent as a passive victim of the avoidance behavior is both understandable and insufficient, and its insufficiency is not about assigning blame, but about accuracy. A framing that positions one person as entirely acted upon and the other as entirely acting obscures the systemic nature of the dynamic and leaves the codependent without access to the agency that genuine change requires. The codependent is not simply the recipient of the avoidance dysfunction. They are a participant in a system that both people's wounds are maintaining, and their participation, while not chosen in any conscious sense, is active rather than passive. The codependent chooses the relationship, often repeatedly, including the moments when leaving would be possible. The codependent interprets the avoidant behavior through a framework that consistently attributes it to their own inadequacy, rather than to the avoidant's psychological patterns. The codependent performs the emotional labor that the system requires without examining what the performance costs them or what it enables in the other person. None of these are free choices made from a position of full information and psychological wholeness. They are expressions of a wound that has its own logic and its own imperatives, but they are not nothing. They are the codependent's contribution to the maintenance of a system that is harming them, and recognizing that contribution is not the same as blaming them for it. It is the beginning of the access to agency that the victim framing forecloses. Similarly, framing the avoidant as a perpetrator who is deliberately exploiting the codependent's vulnerability misrepresents what is happening in a way that also obstructs change. The avoidant is not executing a strategy. They are expressing a wound with a logic and imperatives of its own. The harm they generate in the dynamic is real and significant. And the avoidant who is not doing any work to understand or modify their patterns bears responsibility for that harm in the way that any person does for the effects of their unexamined behavior. But they are not the predator to the codependent's prey. They are someone whose wound happened to be compatible with another person's wound in a way that created a system both of them are living inside, without fully seeing. Number 10. What genuine change requires from both people, and why the system resists it. The codependent-avoidant dynamic is one of the most stable relational configurations that exists, and its stability is not a product of its health. It is a product of the way each person's wound reinforces the other's defensive patterns in a loop that does not generate enough internal pressure to break itself. The codependent's pursuit confirms the avoidant's belief that closeness means pressure, which confirms the avoidant's withdrawal, which confirms the codependent's belief that they are not enough to be fully met, which intensifies the pursuit. The loop runs continuously, efficiently, and without requiring either person to do anything they are not already organized to do. This is why the dynamic persists even when both people are aware of it. Awareness of a system does not automatically generate the disruption the system requires to change. Genuine change in the codependent requires something more fundamental than behavioral modification. It requires the gradual rebuilding of a self-concept that is organized around internal rather than external reference points. The codependent who can locate their sense of value in something other than the avoidance availability. Who can regulate their own emotional state without requiring the avoidance responsiveness to do so? Who can be with the discomfort of the avoidance withdrawal without converting it immediately into action, aimed at ending the discomfort? Has disrupted their role in the system. This disruption is not comfortable. The codependent who stops pursuing the avoidant during a withdrawal episode will encounter the full weight of the anxiety that the pursuit was designed to manage. And sitting with that anxiety without acting on it is one of the most psychologically demanding things the dynamic asks of the person who decides to change it. The codependent's change also requires a reckoning with the self-erasure the dynamic has produced, a return to needs, preferences, and relational requirements that the relationship has trained them to regard as excessive. This return involves grief. Grief for the time during which those needs went unmet. Grief for the version of themselves they abandoned in order to fit inside the relationship. Grief for the relationship as they understood it, once the understanding of the dynamic becomes accurate enough to be unignorable. Genuine change in the avoidant requires something equally fundamental and equally difficult: the willingness to recognize the function that the codependent behavior serves in their own regulatory system. The avoidant who can see that they have been using another person's pursuit as a distance regulation mechanism, that their withdrawal is not simply an expression of their preferences, but a systemic behavior with systematic effects on the other person, is in a position to begin taking responsibility for the dynamic in a way that makes different behavior possible. This recognition is profoundly threatening to the avoidant self-concept, because it requires acknowledging a form of relational need that the independence narrative exists precisely to deny. The avoidant who does this work discovers, beneath the recognition of the dynamic, the wound that the dynamic was built to protect. And confronting that wound is the beginning of the change that no amount of behavioral adjustment without it can actually produce. The system resists change from both directions with equal force. The codependent who begins to change their role will find that the avoidance system responds, often with a temporary increase in pursuit that mimics closeness long enough to draw the codependent back to their familiar position. The avoidant who begins to engage more genuinely will find that the codependent system responds with anxiety rather than relief, because genuine avoidant engagement disrupts the very distance pursuit cycle that the codependent's nervous system has been organized around. Both people in the process of genuine change will experience the relationship as more turbulent rather than less, because the system they have built is self-stabilizing and will exert its stabilizing force against any change that threatens its equilibrium. Conclusion: the codependent-avoidant dynamic is not a relationship between a healthy person and a damaged one. It is a relationship between two people whose wounds are so precisely complementary that they found each other with the unerring accuracy of two puzzle pieces that were shaped by the same hand. The codependents need to be needed, and the avoidants need to be pursued without being asked to fully show up fit together with an elegance that neither person designed and both people suffer within. The suffering is not equal. The codependent's suffering is more visible, more expressed, more present in the daily texture of the relationship. But the avoidance suffering, quieter and more private and more thoroughly denied, is not less real. What the codependent must eventually come to understand is that the love they are extending in this dynamic, however genuine its feeling, is not reaching the person they are extending it toward in any form that can transform either of them. It is feeding a system. The avoidance wound is not healed by the codependent's pursuit. It is managed by it. The codependent's wound is not addressed by the avoidance intermittent warmth. It is activated and reactivated by it. Both people are, inside this dynamic, actively maintaining rather than in any meaningful sense healing the injuries that brought them together in the first place. The maintenance is comfortable enough, in its particular and limited way, to continue indefinitely across years and sometimes decades. It is not comfortable enough, in any deeper or more meaningful sense of the word, to be mistaken by either person for what they actually came into a relationship to find and genuinely need. What both people need is not each other in the configuration the dynamic has produced. What they need is the specific difficult work of understanding their own wound well enough to stop expressing it through their partner. The codependent needs to find themselves again, to rebuild the internal reference point that the relationship has eroded, to discover that their value does not require constant demonstration through the management of someone else's distance. The avoidant needs to find the wound beneath the independence, to allow the attachment system to be present without routing it into suppression, to discover that genuine closeness does not produce the catastrophe the wound has always predicted. These discoveries, for both people, require time and honesty, and the specific kind of discomfort that arrives when a person stops doing the thing their wound has always done and waits, without their habitual defense, to see what is actually there. What is there, in both people beneath the dynamic and the wound and the years of adaptation, is something that the dynamic itself has been working, since the beginning, to prevent them from finding. The genuine self with genuine needs, deserving genuine connection, rather than the managed proximity that their respective wounds together learn to call love. The codependent who arrives at this understanding does not always leave, and in the right circumstances, that is not a failure of understanding, but a choice made from a different position. Sometimes the understanding produces a change in the dynamic that transforms the relationship rather than ending it. But the transformation, when it happens, requires the codependent to stop being the person the system needs them to be. The reliable pursuer, the emotional laborer, the one who makes the avoidance distance manageable by filling the space between them with their own longing. When the codependent stops doing this, the system loses its primary stabilizing mechanism, and the avoidant is confronted, possibly for the first time in the relationship, with the actual weight of what their withdrawal costs. This confrontation does not guarantee change in the avoidant, but it is the only condition under which genuine change becomes possible, because it removes the management that has been allowing the avoidant to indefinitely avoid the reckoning their own unexamined patterns genuinely require. The codependent's greatest act of love toward both themselves and the person they have been organized around for so long is not to pursue more skillfully or more patiently. It is, finally and with full understanding of what it costs, to stop.